meeting is now being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Kamik. I am the Subcommittee Chair for the Recycled Water Committee for the Governor's Water Augmentation Council. We're going to start this meeting of the Recycled Water Committee on January 24th, 2017. I want to welcome everybody, not only in the room, but also I believe we have some people who will be listening in on the phone. Just a reminder, this meeting is now being recorded. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is the second meeting of the Recycled Water Committee formed by the Governor's Water Augmentation Council. This committee has been tasked with exploring reclaimed water project opportunities on a statewide level. The Recycled Water Committee members seated around this table are either members of the GWAC or have been appointed by members of the Council on their behalf. So once again, my name is John Kamik. I'm the Director of Marana Water, and I'm going to introduce the people around the table, starting to my left.
Tim Tomyer, Director of Tucson Water.
Chuck Graff, Principal Hydrogeologist with ADEQ.
My name is Brian Payne. I'm a Policy Analyst at AMWA.
Jerry Walker from ADWR.
Philip Richards with Salt River Project.
Martin Stiles, ADWR.
Thank you. For those of you that have the agenda, as you can see, today's meeting, we will have two presentations. The first will be given by Chuck Graff of ADEQ, and Chuck's going to talk to us about more or less the conclusions on the advisory panel on emerging contaminants that was formed several years ago under Governor Brewer. And then the presentation immediately following Chuck's will be from Mr. Tim Tomyer, the Director of Tucson Water, and he's going to give us an update on the Steering Committee on Arizona Potable Reuse. So at this point, I'd like to ask Chuck if he'd like to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Do you want me to talk from here then? Okay, very good. Thank you for having me today, John. Today's talk is a boring title, but it's so long that it sort of takes up all the room. But it's on the Advisory Panel on Emerging Contaminants, or APEC. And so I think one of the things you can ask is why another panel? I pulled out just a couple of headlines off the internet here of why emerging contaminants are sort of in the news, and you could probably find 50 or 100 more of these type of headlines within a few minutes. So, emerging contaminants, what are they? Well, they are a lot of things, and there's different ways they get into the environment, different routes and occurrences in the environment, but they include things like human drugs, veterinary drugs, and I won't read all those. Flame retardants, which are a big issue now, disinfection byproducts, fragrances in all our personal care products, algae cyanotoxins are a big thing. So as I mentioned, there's different sources and different pathways, and when we think about emerging contaminants, oftentimes we just think about the things that go down in the sewer and end up going into a sewage treatment plant and coming out in the treated wastewater on the other side. But there's also other routes, cattle feedlots and antibiotics and flame retardants, which probably have different routes, go into the atmosphere and can get in our water. And there's an emerging terminology, too. There's so many different names that people have called these things. And the report, our final report of our APEC, our Advisory Panel on Emerging Contaminants, tended to use the word ECs, but the terminology that you see probably most frequently in the literature is compounds of emerging concern, or CECs. And so there are different super categories and subcategories of these things. You see the trace organic contaminants, which have been called torcs and trocs in the literature, and microconstituents. EDCs, endocrine disrupting compounds, are a subset of the emerging contaminants. Kind of like you can have your pie too, pharmaceuticals in the environment there. And in the European Union, they actually have definitions now for what they call emerging substances and emerging pollutants. So if you look in their literature, you'll probably see those terminologies. So it's an ever-growing list, kind of new substances, emerging contaminants become issues of concern every day. Things like disinfection byproducts, the haloacetic acids or HAAs, and NDMA is another disinfection byproduct. When we disinfect water with chlorine, it's a byproduct of that is carcinogenic and is a worry. Sucralose, which is an artificial sweetener, it goes through your body, unmetabolized, and goes through a sewage treatment plant unmetabolized essentially too. And so you find it in our treated wastewater. Microbeads are a new thing, particularly in the Great Lakes area. Iopramide, which is an X-ray contrast agent, you can see in the water. And then some of the emerging bacteria, Legionella right now, is a big concern. Because it may reside actually in biofilms within the distribution system of drinking water systems. And the anti-resistant bacteria, anti-resistant genes is a very emerging concern with a lot of research being directed there. And in the center there, PFOS and PFOA, which are flame retardants, and that has gotten a lot of concern and research lately. So, yes, another panel, and so what I was going to talk about today was the origin of the advisory panel on emerging contaminants, its work, what was in the final report, and some of the report recommendations. So the APEC sort of arose out of a blue ribbon panel on water sustainability. The final report was in the end of 2010, which was a joint effort of ADQ, DWR, and the Arizona Corporation Commission. But there were some recommendations in that report that said that the state should examine the presence of pharmaceuticals and personal care products in Arizona's water, expand our education and outreach programs with respect to those compounds, expand our drug take-back programs, and promote research. So in response to those recommendations, ADEQ convened APEC in June 2012. We issued a call for applications to participate, and we were expecting maybe a panel of 15 or so. And we got a lot of applications from very highly qualified people. So rather than keeping people out, we actually raised the level of participation on the panel, and we had, in the end, 35 participants. So we held our first meeting in December of 2012. So our objectives for this panel is that we wanted it to be an open forum. So when we were talking about emerging contaminants and these type of contaminants in water, one of the things that ADEQ said is that we wouldn't be using any of what comes out of the panel for regulatory purposes, in other words, for enforcement, so there would be an open forum. And we had hoped that the panel and the final report would be able to provide guidance on identifying and managing these chemical and microbial emerging contaminants, and that's actually a decision that was made. Typically when you think of emerging contaminants, or at least a lot of people think of the chemical side of it, but we wanted to include microbial contaminants because they're actually a concern to water utilities and can have acute health impacts. And we wanted the panel to identify research opportunities to provide guidance on particularly for water utilities, on communicating on emerging contaminant issues, and we wanted the panel to advise ADEQ and the water utilities on those that threaten the safety of water. And lastly, it was hoped that Arizona would become an influential voice on emerging contaminant issues statewide and nationally. I'll try to get the right one here. There we go. So very soon after the first meeting, the panel actually decided to divide up into 3 committees to address these different aspects of the issue. And John Kamik was the chair of the Chemical Emerging Contaminants Committee. Jeff Pravat was out of Pima County Wastewater as the chair of our Microbial Emerging Contaminants. And then Dan Quintanar out of Tucson Water was Education and Outreach chair. And those 3 committees really did the bulk of the work that ended up in the final report. So there was a website for containing everything that the panel did, and you can go there and you can find the meeting minutes and presentations there, and it's also where you can download the final report of APEC. So the challenges when you're dealing with emerging contaminants is that there are new chemicals, complex relationships, and limited information. And I saw this statement that there was 15,000 new chemicals coming into the market or into our society a day, and I actually couldn't believe it. I went to the references, and the Chemical Abstract Service actually registers 15,000 new chemicals a day, which is kind of hard to believe, but that's how many of these new chemicals coming in today are coming in each day, and many of them have very, very little information about toxicity, about fate and transport in the environment, about treatability, those type things. In addition, there's a lot of water-based and waterborne pathogens that are, in some cases, been of concern for a while, but that we're also finding new ones to worry about from a drinking water standpoint. And there's a challenge in communicating the risk of these things in typically very, 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 very low levels in water. So, in addition, we see a lot of these because our technology for detection has just increased tremendously. When I came in and was working on contaminants at ADEQ quite a few years ago, we were talking about several parts per billion as being detection levels. Now we're 1,000, 10,000 times even more below that. And so, we're using really highly sophisticated equipment and achieving very low detection levels. I have a picture there of the apparatus they used in 1799. Also, I think the clothing is a little more dapper now, too. So the final report defined an emerging contaminant as a chemical or microbial contaminant that is not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act through an established numeric maximum contaminant level. And as we'll see, there's actually a few exceptions to that, so that would be both chemical and microbial contaminants. So the emerging contaminants, the concern about emerging contaminants actually varies within Arizona depending on where you are. In Flagstaff, as a result of using reclaimed water for snowmaking up there, The issue of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and antibiotic-resistant genes has come to the fore there, and it's actually spurred a lot of research into whether this is an actual concern or not, and trying to understand whether they are viable, whether they cause health effects, and what sort of concentrations. In Phoenix area, an example of emerging contaminant of concern is hexavalent chromium. We regulate total chromium in the drinking water and have a standard for that, but now hexavalent chromium, which is the carcinogenic valence of chromium, there's indications that perhaps we should develop a standard that's much lower than the standard for total chromium to protect from the health impacts of that. In Lake Mead, Mojave, and Havasu, and also on Salt River lakes too, cyanotoxins have been a cause of concern, actually a concern about using beaches and fish kills in those areas. In Tucson, 1,4-dioxane, unregulated constituent that was part of the disposal of some solvents back in the early days, part of the Superfund site. It's unregulated, and that's created a big issue in treating that for the city of Tucson and others, and determining what's the appropriate level, because no standards have been set for that yet either. And then when you're talking about emerging contaminants, a lot of people immediately sort of think about the pharmaceuticals. And I think many of these are what we might call cry wolf contaminants. Of course, the pharmaceuticals probably have the most research of any of these constituents that we talk about in terms of health impacts, in terms of metabolism, in terms of fate and transport. And what I was trying to show in this slide is that we see these compounds at very, very low levels in treated wastewater, actually in all sorts of waters, but probably the source is treated wastewater. And when we look at those levels and actually compare them with what would be a therapeutic dose, for instance, ibuprofen, 1 tablet, we could be drinking that treated wastewater, the reclaimed water, at 2 liters a day, and it would take 20 years of drinking that wastewater at 2 liters a day to actually get 1 tablet. And you can see sulfamethoxazole there, 290 years to get the equivalent of 1 dose. And actually, you look at some of the other pharmaceuticals, and they're even higher. Things like 17,000 years to get 1 dose. And in part, that's because we can detect these at such low levels in water right now. So I mentioned that we generally talking about things that aren't regulated, but there are a few regulated contaminants also, and are they emerging contaminants? In a way, they are. Atrazine, which for years has had a maximum contaminant level of 3 parts per million, but new information has come up that there might be a more extreme health effects. So looking at that, Legionella has MCL in rule. That's a treatment technology, MCL. So it's not numeric, but it says you should treat your water. I think it's, I'm sure John would know, but essentially, I think chlorinated to a certain level. But now there's a concern about Legionella because that it may be residing in the biofilms and distribution system pipes. And if the chlorination level drops, it comes out of those biofilms and can move through the drinking water system. It becomes aerosolized in showers, places like that, and you can breathe it in and get a case of Legionella. And then there's renewed concern over some of the legacy contaminants like lead, the Flint water crisis, fluoride, chromium, and I mentioned especially chrome-6. So it took a while to get out the final report. It was an all-volunteer effort, but the final report did come out in September of 2016. It's available on the web, as I noted earlier. And these are the contents of the report. Chapter 4, I'm not going to talk about today, but there's a discussion on the different sources of water in Arizona and how the emerging contaminants relate to each of those. And then there's the different types of emerging contaminants that we have found in Arizona's water in Chapter 5. Actually, a really good summary of research on emerging contaminants in Arizona. Arizona is actually one of the leading states in pursuing and researching emerging contaminants. Then there's chapters on guidance on how to deal with emerging contaminants for utilities and for the public, and it rounds out with some recommendations. So these are the water sources that the report looked at. Of course, groundwater, the Colorado River and CAP main stem, and the water that's coming in from Lake Havasu into interior Arizona and the CAP. The other surface waters, which would be primarily the Agua Fria and Salt River Lakes, and Verde River Lakes. The drinking water, the treated drinking water that's going into drinking water systems, and then lastly, reclaimed water. And I showed that picture there because, just in the Phoenix area alone, I think there's 22 water treatment plants that get their water from CAP water through the CAP canal that serves something like over 3 million people. So this is just a pie chart that kind of shows those different contributions with about equal amounts of groundwater and Central Arizona project water, 20% being other in-state rivers. And by a calculation I did, a little over 5% now is reclaimed water, either going for different reuses or being recharged. So one of I think the main accomplishments of this report is that a lot of data was compiled from these different water sources that have been sampled for emerging contaminants. And they looked at a lot of analysis, and in the appendix of the report, it lists 109 emerging contaminants that have been found in Arizona water at quantifiable levels. And probably the bulk of them are organic chemicals, but it also includes inorganic chemicals and microorganisms. So out of those 109, this is kind of a summary of what's been detected at quantifiable levels in water. So 65 of those compounds in groundwater, 66 in drinking water at some level, reclaimed water 64. And I'm not sure how much importance you can actually attach to those numbers, because some of those sources have been sampled a lot more than others, and different suites of contaminants have been sampled. But I think it just shows that these chemicals are in all these sources of water at very, very, very low levels. So this is a chart or table that shows which emerging contaminants out of that list of 109 were found in all 5 sources of water, and I think there were 16 of them. So things like the herbicide atrazine, and then some very, very what's the word I want to use? Recalcitrant compounds that are usually associated with anticonvulsants that go through the treatment plant with almost not being affected at all, and that's the carbamazepine and primidone, and I thought there was one other. But anyway, you see those a lot. DEET, our insect repellent. Just anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen, naproxen. I mentioned sucralose. Sucralose is actually goes through the treatment plant so well that it's been used as a tracer to try to determine where there's been an influence of wastewater in other waters. So one thing the panel really did not look at, and it was outside the scope, though, was the impact on surface water. And that is an important impact because when we talk about drinking, we only drink 2 liters a day, but aquatic fish and organisms are actually living in that water full time. I think in this state, we don't have as many aquatic systems and fisheries like that actually are impacted by wastewater as other states. But it's still a big concern. It's probably where actually the most visible impacts of emerging contaminants are. But again, this is outside the scope of the APEC report, which is mainly concerned with addressing emerging contaminants in drinking water. So I think a little perspective on these contaminants of emerging concern. Again, treatment plants aren't the only source of those, the treated wastewater, the sewage that comes in and then passes through the treatment plant. But one of the benefits that we have in Arizona is that under ADEQ rules, we mandate that all new and expanding wastewater treatment plants have to put in high-performance treatment that includes nitrogen removal. And this is really something that's not a requirement in a lot of places in the U.S. But a corollary benefit of doing this high-performance treatment is that we have the success of anoxic and oxic processes in a wastewater treatment plant, these different kind of groupings of bacteria that can attack some of these substances as they're being treated. So if they don't respond to aerobic, they might respond to anaerobic bacteria. And because this process takes longer, you have actually a longer residence time within the treatment plant that can aid in their degradation. So the upshot of it is that in the traditional forms of treatment, we might get somewhat low removal of a lot of these CECs, but with these high-performance treatment we have in virtually all of our larger treatment plants now, we get much better removal. So we're ahead of the game compared to a lot of areas around the country. So on the drinking water side here, a Water Research Foundation report a number of years ago said that after assessing all the information on emerging contaminants and their concentrations and known health impacts, that there's no imminent threat to humans at the concentrations that occur in drinking water. And yet our APEC report says that drinking water utilities should create a monitoring and surveillance program. They should respond under a risk-based decision framework. They should participate in research, and a lot of municipalities are contributing, actual dollars for that. And they should develop a communication plan. And so this is just one of the graphics that are out of the report for utilities developing outreach tools for different audiences. I think that was it, yeah, okay. So here are some of the other recommendations. It said ADQ should establish a permanent advisory panel. We kind of wound this advisory panel up at the end of 2016. And that under this panel, a research committee should be formed to identify identify research topics, and the actual report specified a number of these things, antibiotic-resistant genes and bacteria, because that has become a real public issue up in Flagstaff in particular. Looking at more cost-effective treatment technologies, in particular inexpensive laboratory methods. When we look at all these tests that we do for emerging contaminants, they are not cheap. And in fact, to do a full scan, and some of the people around the table who have utilities could probably tell me the most recent, but to do a full scan, what's considered to be a full and somewhat sufficient scan of emerging contaminants, might cost up to $1,000 per sample. So you look at City of Tucson, up. John's saying up. So you look at City of Tucson with, 200 wells? Doing just one sample of each of those wells one time starts getting into big money. So it's very expensive to do this work. And as a comparison, this report looked at ECs in those waters I mentioned earlier, but, we probably need to compare those with what's in harvested rainwater and even what's in bottled water, that you can buy in your market to get a benchmark there. And because of the cost, the report recommended that we facilitate a statewide laboratory consortium to pool resources. And on the sort of supply side, the upstream side of the treatment plant, expand and strengthen hazardous waste and pharmaceutical take-back collaborations. And I know that the photo on the right is Gilbert, and I know that Pima County in southern Arizona has some pretty aggressive has a pretty aggressive program, and probably others too. And we should continue to conduct and sponsor workshops on emerging contaminants, collaborate with the universities, which there's a lot of that going on already. One thing we don't have yet is electronic repository of all Arizona emerging contaminants research. As I mentioned, the report actually provides a good roundup of some of the research that's been done in Arizona. Sponsor risk communication training. And for ADQ, and sort of to end my presentation here, the next step for us would be evaluate how to implement these report recommendations kind of in a time of lower resources. So I finish by saying that you can get the copy of the report off our website and print it off. And with that, I'll end and take any questions, I guess.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Before we ask the committee members if they have any additional questions, I did want to recognize we had two committee members join us right at the beginning of your talk. So if you can introduce yourself for the record real quick.
Bob Lotz with Arizona Public Service Company.
Great. Thank you. So, Chuck, anybody at the table, this was a very detailed effort done by ADQ for a number of years, as you see in Chuck's presentation. A lot of information pushing Arizona forward, I think, in many respects to some of the other states. So is there any questions from the committee members on Chuck's presentation in particular, or any additional information? Bob?
I have one, John. Thank you. Chuck, did the panel discuss, once we were able to identify these new contaminants and then we come up with a methodology to maybe remove them out of the water, but now we have the waste stream. After we remove them, they didn't just go away. Did we talk about final disposition of this concentrate now?
That is an excellent question. and no, the report didn't really address that in any detail, but that is an excellent question about the final disposition, and that's something that I've even been kind of pressing on. And if we're going to be doing some of this advanced treatment, how are we going to deal with these side streams or waste streams?
Yeah, if I can add to that a little bit also. Yeah, Chuck was right. It didn't get into the final disposition, as you said, but there are some of the advanced treatment technologies that are effective for removing compounds like 1,4-dioxane would be advanced oxidation, which essentially is energizing and shattering the molecule and destroying it in its place. So for some of those ones, we know what the final disposition is because it's absolute destruction of the molecule, but it depends on what the compound is.
For some of the Charles Mosley, for some of the compounds that are retained, in other words, aren't treated effectively by the wastewater process, was there a recommendation to see how much of these compounds, like sucralose, are being produced annually, since they seem to stay in the system?
control on the upstream. The report addressed control on the upstream side mainly through proper disposal of these personal care products and pharmaceuticals. Nationally, they're addressing some of these, trying to find green alternatives to a lot of these chemicals. A report, and I can't remember, might have touched on that, but it was not a large piece of the report. But, that's something that should be done, and it probably would have to be done at the national level.
Thanks, John. I just had a question about on the upstream, on the supply side, the events for disposal of pharmaceuticals and that sort of thing. Did the group have any discussion about even farther upstream of that education, like when things are purchased? Has there ever been any efforts done in that arena?
Did you call a little bit more?
Well, when we met with actually some of the pharmacies around the state, and in particular in the Tucson area, since most of us were working out of the Tucson area, and we found that more and more pharmacies, particularly the national pharmacies, are starting to provide educational materials right at the pharmacy on how to properly dispose of the unused pharmaceuticals. So when we noticed that was occurring, that was obviously a good benefit to us. We didn't have to go in there as a drinking water supplier or the water treatment agency to try to explain to a pharmacy how to tell their customers how to dispose of their materials. They're already proactively doing that. And one of the reasons they may be proactively doing that is because they're noticing that, as well as we notice in the environmental arena, that some of these compounds are being passed to the environment that are lingering and not being metabolized as readily. Any other additional questions from committee members? If not, we're going to move on to our second talk, which is Director Tim Tomyer from Tucson Water. He's going to be giving the update on the steering committee for Arizona potable reuse. And then after Tim's talk, we'll open it up to more questions for those of us on the committee as well as those in the audience. Thank you.
All right, good morning, and thank you for having us here to talk about an update on potable reuse in the state. The Steering Committee on Arizona Potable Reuse, as we'll talk about in a moment, was also an outcome of the Governor Brewer's Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations. Whereas the APEC group was led by ADEQ, knowing that the number of recommendations that came out of the Blue Ribbon Panel would have exhausted state resources in order to be able to really tackle all the issues that came out. Water Reuse Arizona, which is a state section of the National Water Reuse Association, made an offer to the ACC, ADWR, and ADEQ to advance the steering committee for potable reuse in order to move that conversation forward, but also leverage other state resources beyond just the state agencies. So it was done definitely in cooperation with the state agencies, but today I'm presenting on behalf of Water Reuse Arizona and the steering committee. So potable reuse, the time has come. This has been a large theme, not just in Arizona, but in the industry across the U.S. and across the world. When we look at where potable reuse is in the current discussion, there are a number of states that have either implemented potable reuse in some form or fashion, or are actively looking at their frameworks that permit it and do it in a safe manner, or are studying and doing white papers on the eventual deployment of potable reuse in their states. Almost every time I give this talk, or something similar to it, I add another state. Immediately in the vicinity of Arizona to the west, California had a large effort looking at potable reuse and in this case, direct potable reuse as a water supply. They, at the end of 2016, essentially wrapped up that effort. And at the end of the day, it was their Division of Drinking Water that came forward and said that potable reuse is feasible and a framework could be developed to do it in a safe manner. There was many millions of dollars of research that went into that California DPR initiative, is what it's often referred to as. And that research, while centered on the questions coming out of California, is certainly of interest to Arizona, and we've been tracking that closely. To the east, state of Texas actually has had direct potable reuse projects in operation. There were two. There's currently still one. The Big Spring, Texas plant is still in operation. Wichita Falls, Texas had a direct potable reuse plant in operation right up until it rained. Their surface water impoundments filled up literally overnight, and as part of their plan was they were doing direct potable reuse because of supply urgency, and they eventually were going to transition to an indirect potable reuse approach. When the rains came, they were able to shut down the DPR plant and move forward with their indirect potable reuse long-term solution. The state of New Mexico, the village of Cloudcroft, has been long on the radar as a community that would have potable reuse. A plant's been essentially built. It's still in the process of being tested and fired up. And they also have a kind of an operational framework guidance document that's been in progress. Moving further east, I don't want to skip Oklahoma. Oklahoma also has a number of potable reuse projects on the drawing board, and at the most recent National Symposium on Reuse, there was a whole section of talks just on different Oklahoma-based projects. Florida had a whole day of meeting with elected officials talking about the issue of potable reuse, and also Clearwater has a demonstration project going. Georgia has one of the largest demonstration projects going on right now in the Gwinnett County area, and it actually is looking at different technologies that could be used to do potable reuse and comparing and contrasting them. North Carolina recently repealed their prohibition against direct potable reuse, and the state of Colorado and the state of Nevada, both of them are looking at frameworks for potable reuse. Recently, Nevada had a reuse rule update similar to what's going on in Arizona right now, where they address some of these issues, more driven out of the northern Nevada area as opposed to the southern Nevada area, but certainly comprehensive in its nature. And Colorado has done a white paper on it and is advancing some deeper looks into potable reuse. So Arizona is certainly not alone in this. We're close to the forefront, but we're not on the bleeding edge of it either. And the Steering Committee on Arizona Potable Reuse has been driving that effort here locally. We have things to build on. A framework for direct potable reuse led by the National Water Research Institute and its expert panel in collaboration with Water Reuse, American Water Works Association, and the Water Environment Federation. They published this guidance document in 2015, which sets forth a basic framework from which states and communities can at least have a groundwork to begin with, so they don't have to start from ground zero and really understand the state of the science. This was followed up in 2016 by the release of a compendium document on all that research that was done in California and other locations. There was a compendium document that goes through and synthesizes all of that research to really bring you up to speed fairly quickly. The Texas experience, where they've had an active potable reuse project and another one that was operational and several more that are on the books, they have a resource document, which is not a regulatory framework. The way Texas handles potable reuse is they do it through individual permits. So it's really a negotiation of an individual permit between the community that's wanting to do it and the regulatory agencies. So it's really a one-on-one, case-by-case discussion of how to go about doing it, how to monitor it, things of that nature. As I mentioned, in California, they did the evaluation of the feasibility of direct potable reuse, and in California, it's more of a broad-based approach. They've addressed how to do indirect potable reuse through groundwater replenishment. They're addressing how to do indirect potable reuse through surface water augmentation, and then they did the expert panel on direct potable reuse. In California, while not strictly a prescribed approach, this basic framework does tend to drive you toward a technology solution, which is the use of reverse osmosis, or RO, as a barrier within direct potable use. This may or may not be the right approach for Arizona. In California, when you are doing reverse osmosis, you're generating a brine waste stream. In California, you're by the ocean. You have a disposal mechanism for that that's economical. Here in Arizona and in other inland locations, that would be an expense that may or may not be economical. And as I mentioned, in Gwinnett County and in other locations, they're looking at non-RO alternatives that could also be as viable for potable reuse. So California will be an interesting case for us to pay attention to, but may not be the correct model for Arizona. So is Arizona there yet? Kind of yes and no. We've had an ongoing conversation about potable reuse in the state. On the timeline to the left, I show the before in quotes, which was we don't have any operating direct potable use facilities in the state. We don't have any applications pending before ADEQ, but we've known for a period of time that potable reuse would be needed in Arizona and that we would be wrestling with it sooner or later. Well, later has become sooner, and we have some communities that are at least actively looking at it as a potential option. The Governor's Blue Ribbon Panel, published in 2010, called out developing a framework, or at least having a conversation around it as a recommendation. The Steering Committee on Arizona Potable Reuse was formed in 2012, essentially at the same time as the APEC panel, in order to advance this conversation. A number of advisory panels were completed in 2013. We didn't duplicate what APEC did, really just collaborated with APEC on emerging contaminants, but we did look at treatment technologies, water quality regulatory frameworks, and public acceptance and communication as key areas to explore early on in this process. Once those were completed, we did contract with NWRI, which you see that acronym coming up a lot related to potable reuse, and they're the ones that did the expert panel in California. They've done the work in New Mexico. They've done work for water reuse on a national level, and they're a good partner on this topic. So they've been working on a draft document that really sets a state of the science on potable reuse and a state of where is Arizona prepared and where does our regulatory framework need to be augmented in order to accommodate potable reuse. So phase one, those advisory panels we did prior to the involvement of NWRI, we did have a number of key outcomes. First of all, potable reuse is on the table in Arizona. It is a timely conversation. This is no longer a theoretical conversation to have. When we look at what's actually occurring in our water systems in the state, indirect potable reuse is happening. We just don't always call it that. We do have a framework, especially through our groundwater systems, where indirect potable reuse can and does occur. There are more on the way, and it's actually becoming a more recognized discussion around what we're doing and how we manage our effluent water resources, and does that fit somewhere on the potable reuse spectrum. When we look at direct potable reuse and moving more and more down the spectrum toward very, very direct treatment through a series of processes that lead to potable reuse, we need a flexible regulatory framework. The conclusions of the steering committee was that neither the Texas model nor the California model are a perfect fit for Arizona. There are elements to draw from both and do something that's really right for the state. There are some remaining concerns. While we feel that there's a number of answers that have been generated for Arizona, there are some questions that we need to continue to deal with. The unregulated contaminants, as Chuck just spent time discussing, are something that is always going to be an active part of the discussion. Another area of active interest is process monitoring and reliability. I'll come back to that. But it's really, you need to have monitoring programs that assure that your processes are performing correctly throughout the process, not just at the end of the pipe, at the very end of your treatment process, but along the way to make sure that you're detecting issues along the way and you have alternatives, either redundant treatment systems or alternative ways of treating a particular contaminant to make sure that you are fail-safe. Brine management or brine avoidance, as I mentioned, the use of reverse osmosis, while a very viable technology and a very beneficial technology, does have a byproduct associated with it. How do you minimize that brine, or how do you avoid that brine in the first place? And then finally defining safe. This is a difficult conversation to have, but it's a necessary conversation to have. Because at the end of the day, you need to be, as a water provider, you need to be able to assure your customers that what you're doing is safe. Safe is a tough word to define. In our case, we feel it's not sufficient to just say, this meets all regulatory standards, which is often a common line used and is truthful, but it doesn't cover things like emerging contaminants or things that don't have a regulatory standard. And it doesn't also bring forward all of the things you're doing to assure the safety of the water. So it's going to be the question that will be asked, and you need to be able to answer it confidently. So we're hoping to develop a framework that allows that. The NWRI report purpose, provide recommendations regarding the development of regulations on DPR in Arizona, working with some stakeholder groups and drawing from this nationwide and international knowledge related to the state of the industry. How do we go about having a path forward in Arizona? Why now? In addition to this emerging need for it in Arizona, ADAQ has the Reclaim Water rulemaking, which has been opened up recently, and this would be one of many topics that could be addressed during that process. So timing is everything when it comes to regulations, especially in Arizona. So the time is now. This is the time to have this discussion. Framework activities, and this is picking up when NWRI became involved. In April of 2016, we had a workshop with the steering committee, a couple of other Arizona-based experts in potable reuse. Even though potable reuse has not occurred in this state in a direct manner, frankly, some of our consultants that operate in the state have done this in other locations, El Paso, California. So we wanted to leverage their knowledge directly on this. So that was a beginning of how would a framework look. And then in May, there was more of a public workshop at the AZ Water Association annual conference in Glendale, where we had about, I think, 60 folks in attendance really asking a variety of questions, really helping shape what would go into this report. The draft report has been delayed a bit due to some staffing changes at NWRI, but that's been brought back up to speed. We've actually received a handful of the chapters as a draft form. So the next step is the steering committee will review the draft chapters as they come in, provide comment back up to NWRI, and then when we have a draft that's ready for public review, it will be released. We're expecting that to be sometime around the second quarter of 2017. That a draft of the NWRI report would be available for review. So what does potable reuse look like? What are the key components to it? There are certainly technical questions and issues we need to understand. For the most part, a lot of the technologies are understood, what they can, how they're effective, how they can fit into a potable reuse approach. So we have a lot of foundation there. The outreach component is going to be certainly on a case-by-case and community-by-community basis, but there's actually a toolbox of frameworks available both for the community level and the state level. One of the research projects that was done in California actually focused on public acceptance, and so that was Water Reuse Research Foundation Project 1302 provides that framework, and it's not a finished product, but it's a really good place to start. And then finally, the regulatory framework. This is the part of the triangle that we're trying to really deal with as a SCAPR and work with ADAQ and others in order to implement something that works for the state. So this next slide, I'm just going to talk through a little bit of the complexity we're talking about here. When we're talking about traditional drinking water sources, we do some source water characterization, but we focus a lot of our attention on the end product. The monitoring is at points of entry to the system. That would also be true for potable reuse, but there's a burden of proof we need to meet that's higher than that. And that is all of the technical operation and management barriers that we're providing that transition water from a wastewater effluent to a drinking water source and then ultimately into drinking water. So this is just a generalized overview of what that looks like. And those management, operational, and technical barriers are what we're putting in place to prevent contaminants from making it through our system and into the finished product water. So it's very complex, and it's focused on several steps throughout the way, not just at the end of the pipe. And it goes all the way upstream to a surface water or the wastewater that we're starting with, moving all the way through the different source controls we do in the community. How do we manage our sewer systems? How do we manage our collection systems? How do we manage wastewater treatment when we know that the ultimate end use is potable use? How does that change our thinking? How does that change our framework for how we treat wastewater to begin with? Then certainly there would be advanced treatment steps, which we'll talk about in a moment, that would be targeting the various things that are of concern in a wastewater-derived source water that we need to manage. And then ultimately whatever drinking water treatment occurs at the end of the day and going into the system itself. So we're closing the loop on the urban water cycle. So we're going to be looking throughout that whole loop of the urban water cycle of how to do potable reuse properly. So the report that's under development, a draft guidance framework document, it's got a number of chapters associated with it. Certainly, the Chapter 1, the introduction, really sets the context for Arizona, what our history and comfort level is with the non-potable reuse we've been doing for decades in the state, and how we transition from non-potable and what we would call de facto potable reuse, our current systems, to planned potable reuse. A little bit of discussion about that spectrum between indirect and direct, and then really the lexicon or the terminology that we need to use so that our regulations make sense to our practitioners and vice versa, and that all gets translated in a clear and consistent manner to the community at large. The previous studies, there was a NRC report in 98 and then again in 2012, and those are some foundational studies that help cover what we're trying to accomplish, some of the basic science, and then understanding the risks from microbial and chemical constituents. Again, those are regulated and unregulated at the moment. And then really an overview of what the rest of the report would contain. Chapter 2 really opens up front with the biggest question on everybody's mind, rather than burying it as Chapter 16. Public health considerations. What are the concerns that are out there? How does the drinking water regulatory framework adapt to and or be augmented to cover potable reuse as a source water? We're on an acute level, we have a strong interest on pathogen reduction. That's the thing that we're most concerned about, and if there's something keeping you up at night, it would be how do we assure that pathogens are controlled in a potable reuse environment. It's an overview of the Texas approach. There was another expert panel convened by NWRI with called 1102, which was another approach early on in the discussions of potable reuse, and then the California approach. So it's drawing from all those state-of-the-science measures on how we should deal with pathogens. And then on the chemical side, these are more the chronic health concerns that we want to make sure are also addressed. What do MCLs do for us? What are some things that maybe fall outside of the MCL realm that would be beneficial to consider in a potable reuse scenario? The trace organics, 1,4-dioxane and NDMA, these are emerging contaminants, and disinfection byproducts. So there's a lot to wrestle with here. And then Chapter 3 moves into what we call potable reuse recommendations. Again, these are recommendations. These are not guidance. These are not regulation yet. These are recommendations for ways to approach it that we feel are right for Arizona. So there's 17 topics, and I'm not going to take another hour of your time to go through all 17. But I wanted to at least show you the list of topics being addressed. And then the ones highlighted by boxes are the ones I'll do a slide each on to just really talk about that particular topic, but also kind of the method that the report uses to lay them out. So it is comprehensive. Step 1, rescind the DPR prohibition currently in state law, or as of today? Still? Okay, you haven't done it yet?
We haven't done it yet.
Okay. As of today, enroll, there's a prohibition against direct consumption of direct potable reuse. If you're going to have direct potable reuse be permitted, you have to remove or rescind the prohibition. But doing it in a context that understands what are you replacing with? How do you go about doing it safely if you are going to remove that prohibition? Different applications of potable reuse, different mechanisms for outreach. Source control is one that I will spend a little bit of time on. We have different classes of water quality, reclaimed water quality in the state. How do we dovetail a potable reuse framework that doesn't reinvent the wheel on how we do reuse in the state, that builds on it, that leverages it? Microbial control, and then closely related is the log removal targets. I'll touch on that here in a bit. Chemical control, as I mentioned earlier. Wastewater treatment is certainly something that we've done. We have over 300 permitted facilities in the state. They have a wide range of how we go about doing wastewater treatment. How do you do wastewater treatment when the end use is potable reuse? And what are we starting from, and how do we need to build to, through advanced water treatment, something that creates a safe source water? Employing bad cat or best available demonstrated control technology is a model used in Arizona for wastewater regulation. It is something that could also be adapted rather than reinvented in the case of potable reuse. Focusing on treatment performance, long-term monitoring, and then what we call critical control points. These are all those critical locations throughout the potable reuse process that need monitoring, and how do we do it best? Certainly, how do we operate facilities, and commensurate with that is how do you have communications between different agencies that might be operating different treatment facilities along this urban water cycle? You may have different agencies operating the wastewater treatment and the advanced water treatment. How do you communicate amongst yourselves? And then the technical management and financial capacity is potable reuse right now something best done by larger cities that have a lot of technical management and financial capabilities, or if it's a small community that may be lacking in that, how do you shore that up to ensure it's done safely? And then, of course, the blanket other considerations. The report also identifies for each of these topic areas whether it's a topic that's best handled as regulation, or is best handled in the permit process, or is best handled as simply guidance. And some of these topics might cross over more than one of those different categories. But the moral of that story is not every part of this needs to be in regulation. Regulation needs to be targeted to the things that are fundamental. Some things that require site-by-site flexibility might be better handled during the permitting process. And then, of course, guidance is really the best practices. So let's take a look in a little bit more detail on some of these topics. So source control. This is something that will probably appear in all three categories: regulation, permit, and guidance. The what of source control? Controlling the discharge of constituents into a wastewater collection system. So controlling things even before it enters the wastewater system. The discharge of constituents in the community can impact wastewater treatment, often are things that are difficult to treat, and may even pass through the wastewater treatment process and become an upstream contaminant to the advanced water treatment that could govern what needs to go into that advanced water treatment. So prevention, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. How do we prevent these constituents from entering the wastewater stream to begin with? Some specific recommendations that are coming forth in the report is understanding the sewer shed and the sources of chemicals. and maybe even understanding how in many communities you have multiple sewer sheds with multiple wastewater treatment plants, which ones need this higher level of regard because they're going to be part of potable reuse, whereas other ones are doing environmental discharge as they do today. Those are also decisions that can be made on a community basis. Minimizing the discharge of those harmful or difficult to treat chemicals, and that regardless of what's done, it'll improve wastewater quality and hopefully facilitate the downstream treatments for potable reuse, and it also will increase community confidence. Chemical control, this is specific to chemicals in wastewater. These are both regulated and unregulated chemicals, as we've been discussing. Typically on the chronic concern, but there are some examples of where they have an acute impact, nitrite being an example. So some specific recommendations with respect to chemical control. You start with the basement. The basement is regulations. You have to meet all MCLs and other state requirements. But in the case of potable reuse, the basement should not be the target zone. You need to be above ground floor with respect to chemical treatment. There are a number of chemicals that have health criteria. They're not regulated as an MCL, but they have a health-based guidance level. Our advocacy would be that you treat those as criteria that you're going to meet or exceed in your potable treatment. This is not the place to argue about whether it's an MCL or a health-based guidance level. Monitoring for surrogates and indicators of treatment. So process monitoring and verification monitoring. As Chuck mentioned, we're adding 15,000 new chemicals per day. Even to run a suite of chemicals that represent the bulk of the chemical catalog is very expensive. So we have to understand classes of chemicals, understand how different treatment processes, they don't necessarily treat an individual chemical, they treat the characteristics of that chemical. So if you're treating for one of those chemicals, you're treating for all of them. How do we draw that list together, and how do we assure that we're doing it correctly through performance monitoring and verification? And then also having kind of a canary in the coal mine here, the use of total organic carbon, not as a regulatory standard, but as an indicator of the overall effectiveness of removing this class of chemicals. It's readily run, it's something we're all familiar with, and it can be an indicator of overall effectiveness. Again, you don't hang your hat on TOC, but you use TOC as something in the toolbox to monitor your situation. Advanced water treatment, this is taking care of the treatment of all of the regulated and unregulated chemicals that are in our source water that are not removed through the wastewater treatment process. This is the vehicle that's going to bring wastewater to becoming a source water for potable supply. So it's very critical. It's the unit processes to treat that and bring it to drinking water standards. This is where we would see a lot of regulatory review on pathogens and chemicals, and the public's going to pay a lot of attention to this because this is where we're providing that surety that this is safe. But we have to define a lot. Our framework has to say what chemicals for, what are you treating for? How do you measure success? How do you measure that you're at 100% reliability and that you are taking the proper steps on engineered storage and other things to make sure that you don't release water that doesn't meet all the standards and standards set just for potable reuse. So one of the things that, or two of the objectives were not be prescriptive on the technologies. Allow individual communities to propose a treatment train that works for their source water to what their drinking water treatment processes would then handle as the last step, so that we don't lock in on one approach, but then require pilot testing on these facilities. We had a discussion within the steering committee of, we know these technologies, we know they work. Why would we have to pilot, or should you only have to pilot in certain circumstances? And where we landed is, hey, this is new to all of us, and even though we've got a lot of experience with these treatment technologies, we've not done this in this state. So coming out of the gate, piloting and demonstration being a requirement in order to move down this path. That's something that, of course, could be modified later once we have some operating facilities. But where we are today, that's not a step to skip. Of course, tracking the research and field experience. One of the things that we're doing is making sure that the steering committee and those that are putting together these recommendations have direct, tangible experience with potable reuse and can confidently say they've not only observed it, but they've tasted it themselves. So one of the things that we're actually doing this March is the water reuse, and many of us already have, but we're making sure that that's not a gap in our knowledge or experience. So this March, in lieu of our traditional strategic planning retreat, we're actually going to 2 operating facilities in California that are operating at a demonstration level, Orange County, City of San Diego. We're going to tour, interact with those agencies, and then taste the end product. We're also, while we're there, going to go to the Carlsbad desalination plant, which has just come online, which is a seawater desal plant. The key to that is to make sure that we're not advocates for something we've not experienced ourselves, but also to really go through the process that we're going to recommend as a best practice to anybody that wants to implement it in their community, which is people to understand it and accept it need to see, feel, and taste what a potable reuse facility would do. So we want to be the first to go through that process in Arizona. Critical control points, this is really that in-plant assurance that everything's going well. There are several points throughout the treatment train where unit processes need to be performing correctly 100% of the time. And you need to have the confidence that they're doing their job throughout the process. So it's a systematic approach to operation and assurance. So you go through a process of basically hazard identification and then control. You identify the hazards, things that could go wrong through the process. That's where you install critical control point monitoring. You monitor those procedures and you take corrective actions and have either redundant treatment or an ability to shut off the end product and recycle the water if you need be. You need engineered storage so that you understand that even when you have monitoring, there's often a time delay between when the water that's being monitored is sampled and when you have results. So we're definitely moving the industry toward real-time monitoring of a number of constituents, easier said than done, but then also reducing the hold times and the analytical times on all other constituents so that you have results on every unit of water before you've actually released it to the next phase of the system, which would be the drinking water plant. It requires a lot of thought and a lot of effort, and there's a lot of activity going on right now looking at monitoring and how to do it better and how to do it more real time. The University of Arizona's West Center out there at the Agua Nueva plant in Tucson is doing a lot of this research right now. The technical management and managerial and financial capacity, it's required by the Safe Drinking Water Act. So all water providers are already demonstrating this. The question that comes up is, even though you can do that with traditional water sources, can you do it with potable reuse? So we don't want that to be an unasked question, and we want it to be something that there's a path forward to demonstrating that either yourself or through the contractual mechanisms you might be using in order to implement it. But it's not something we want to leave to chance. We can certainly build on the existing programs that are out there, but define where has the bar been raised when you're in potable reuse, and how do you demonstrate that? And then certainly pay attention to the smaller systems and make sure that they have resources available in order to demonstrate this and do it well. So with that, I've gone through some of the specifics. There's 11 other topics out there that can be covered in equal detail, and that will all be revealed in the draft report, which is coming soon. But the steering committee does have some conclusions of where we are today and where we're headed. Of course, the Arizona Department of Water Resources in January of 2014 released the Strategic Vision for Water Supply Sustainability. It identified the need depending on what time frame you look at, over the next 25 to 100 years, the state needs between 0.9 to 3.2 million acre-feet of water, new water. So there's definitely a need. And it was the first document that I'm aware of coming from a state agency that made the statement that eventually you get to the point where direct potable reuse for drinking water supplies will become necessary, and I agree. We're not there yet, but some of our communities are very close to that, and our state is certainly in the right space to be having this conversation. So when you look at the future of recycled water in Arizona, it's really a pattern of matching the right water to the right use. We've had ongoing and continuing environmental uses of our reclaimed water. Our reclaimed water itself, our purple pipe systems, those are certainly going to be a valued part of our portfolio moving forward. Industry and agriculture is a large user. In fact, the largest user in the state happens to be our nuclear power plant, APS. We're not expecting to need less power in the future, I don't think. Whoa, I got a little click happy there. Or did you do that? That was me. Okay. This is very much can you hit end for me and I'll just back up a little bit. Almost to the very end. Yeah. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so as this plays out, I've mentioned that in a de facto manner, we already have indirect potable reuse going on in the state. We have a framework that's protective of public health to do that. We need to make sure that we shore that up and assure that moving forward, and then bring direct potable reuse as an alternative for communities that need to evaluate it. The goal is not to maximize direct potable reuse. The goal is to make it available in a safe manner to those communities that will need it when they're ready. And with that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Open it up to the committee members at the table. Do you have any questions for Tim or any questions related to the advancement of direct potable reuse in Arizona?
I have a question. I really struggle with this because I see the need for the state, but I look at the math and I say 5% of our total water is reclaimed water. So 350,000 acre-feet a year spread across the state. I listened to your presentation, which was an excellent presentation, Tim. Thank you very much. But to get to an end product that those of us that do water treatment feel safe to do is going to take an awful lot of capital funds and an awful lot of inline monitoring. And as I look at it and say, man, if I didn't have to do that, I certainly wouldn't. And I liked your point on, there's the large municipality that probably has the financial wherewithal, the training for their operators and everything else. But probably the need for the direct potable reuse is going to be the smaller community that doesn't have that. So I'm sure you guys have all had discussions regarding this. And how do we get from here to there? How does we make our regulators confident that the industry can do that even in a small community setting that may not have the financial wherewithal? And why wouldn't I just continue to do indirect, at least if I could, instead of having now a waste stream to deal with also? And I haven't been in these meetings, but it's just all the thoughts that I continue to have, and your presentation just made me think of that even more.
Right. So I'll take a first perspective on that. I think you're absolutely right. First of all, it's the economics of it, while improved, are not on par with traditional supplies. Direct potable reuse, however, is on par with some other alternatives that some communities are facing, namely seawater desalination, not necessarily brackish water desalination, but seawater desalination, and in some parts of the U.S., compared to importation of water supplies, it can become economically comparable. In Arizona, most of the larger communities aren't resource constrained to the point where they need to, and what we're talking about is water that might take anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 per acre foot to produce. Contrast that to Central Arizona Project water to get delivered to you is $200. You have to treat it from there, but you're not in that $1,000 to $2,000 range yet. But some of these smaller communities where they are resource constrained certainly could be very close to needing this as their next supply. They may not have the geology that facilitates an indirect potable reuse approach. So that's where we're certainly going to have folks faced with a supply availability issue and an inability to do it in an indirect way. So that's where I see that popping up. These are, in many times, going to be smaller communities that do have the challenges of having the technical capability to do it. So how do we as an industry address that, and how do we provide support to that? We all have an interest in this being done well wherever it's done, because whether it's in 2030 or whether it's in 2100, Tucson may need this. So the last thing we want is somebody to fail along the way. So that's why I think you see a lot of input from the industry across the board, even though that might be a certain community that needs to do it. I think we all need to be there to support that community doing it. Quite frankly, that was one of the big questions with Big Spring, Texas. Not a big town, and they were doing the most technologically advanced treatment facility, and everybody was like, well, I hope they don't screw that up. Well, in lieu of that, why don't we find a way to help them do that? So I think that's going to be a part of the Arizona conversations. Whoever is up against that we don't, first of all, say, thankfully that's not me. We say, how can we help? How can we do that well? And then tapping into the expertise in the regulatory agencies and in the consulting community and in the other agencies in the state to do it well.
Thanks, Tim. Just to add on to that, another thing that the group thought about over the last several years when we considered this topic is when we witnessed direct potable reuse taking place in communities of crisis, whether it was Big Spring, Texas, or Wichita Falls, or in California, in some places, we made the realization that if it ever happened to a community in the state of Arizona, we don't want to have to operate in a crisis. So a lot of us working with our regulatory agencies, and particularly ADEQ, seeing what ADWR did in the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, which was revolutionary in Western water resource management, also doing direct potable reuse from a non-crisis perspective in the state of Arizona and getting that done right and making sure we have a framework so when a community is in that jeopardy of a water resource shortfall, we're not making it up on the fly. We already have something that will help guide us through that. So that's the other option that we were looking at while we were moving forward with these potable reuse considerations. Chuck?
Yeah, I was just going to say from a regulatory standpoint, too, it seems like we want to be able to address both IPR and DPR because sometimes, I think as was mentioned, IPR might not be the choice. And if you're going to be treating water to a high level and then, say, putting it into a surface water source, which are actually pretty limited in Arizona in doing that type of IPR and environmental buffer, you might end up having to treat that again. And putting it into groundwater, you might be treating and doing RO on a small volume of water if you did DPR, but moving it into groundwater with high salinity in it and then pumping that back up and then creating massive amounts of high salinity water with RO may not make sense to a community. And so I think it really behooves us to be able to have a regulatory framework that can deal with, all these possibilities that might occur in Arizona.
And one parting thought, which you brought up, relates to certification. So we have operators are trained, educated, and certified for the work that they do, whether it's on the wastewater or the drinking water side. What is this? Is this wastewater? Is this drinking water? And how do we handle the fact that these are advanced treatment processes? So that's another the whole industry is dealing with that. Do you create this other class of certification? Do you add an endorsement to an existing cert? The key is, however you go about doing that, assuring that the people running the facilities are qualified, trained, and certified to do so. So that's another element that's definitely on the radar that's not solved yet, but is a strong consideration.
Excellent. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah.
Philip.
So you mentioned a few communities. There's one in New Mexico, Cloudcraft, that's about done and about ready to put this online. How did they do it? Did they get state help? Did they get federal help?
I'm not sure if they had federal help. They definitely had state help and collaboration. And Cloudcraft's been about done for 10 years. But for Wichita or Big Springs, they would have been first. And it being done in a vacuum of knowledge, it actually way over treats the water. It's got probably duplication of everything, probably to the detriment of the system. But if you're going to do it, that's a place to do it. This is a village of 600 people. It's more of a tourist destination type thing. So you'd love to have a lot more engineering controls there, but they certainly couldn't do it on their own, and so they've needed they've gotten some assistance along the way, certainly at the state level.
Yes. Thank you for that presentation. It was excellent. I kept going back throughout the presentation to your point that it can be very difficult at times to define what is safe due to the inherent nature of, the word, I guess. But, when I think about what is safe, it's really about balancing risks. I mean, you can take away, hypothetically, you might be able to take away all risk, but, at what economic cost? So I guess my question to you is, as a community or as a state is looking at these types of technologies, how should we what would be the process for determining what risks might be acceptable?
I'll take a first cut at that, and then I'll turn it over to Chuck. Certainly, there's going to be many layers to that. So we start with the Safe Drinking Water Act guidelines and the MCLs. We layer on top of that the health-based guidance levels for emerging contaminants. We layer on top of that the critical control point monitoring and assurance that we're never going to have off-spec water leaving the facility. It's all of those technical, operational, and management barriers being, first of all, implemented correctly because we're doing our homework up front, and then operated correctly when we identify how that should be moving forward. The word safe would encompass that all of that is done well. I agree with you that it's a risk-based conversation, and the thing we always go back and forth with is when you get on an airplane, they don't necessarily tell you all the things that could go wrong. They just tell you all the things you need to do when they do go wrong. It's a different way of having a conversation, but this is more assuring that we've addressed all of the different issues surrounding it and are monitoring it in a way that demonstrates that compliance. So it's really not putting our faith in if you apply the right technology you're there. It's that the performance of all of those factors and at the end result is safe.
So, I think one thing you can do is you can compare what we're doing now with drinking water treatment. I think most people say that we have the safest drinking water supply in the world right now. And so for a drinking water treatment plant that uses a surface water source, they would have to monitor for pathogens essentially once a day. I think John was telling me earlier that. And for a groundwater source, maybe a little less. And your test, you get back, it's a culture test 16 hours later or 24 hours later. So what's in the SCAPR document that Tim was talking about for direct potable reuse, they're talking about doing real-time monitoring versus cultured monitoring. And then the log levels of removal, which you really didn't get into there very much, but for under present regulations, it's about 4 log levels or 10,000 times removal. And what's in the SCAPR document now, they're talking about 8 or 9 log levels of capability in the treatment system to remove. So instead of 99.99, you're talking about 99.9999 with about 5 more nines on the end of it. And so in that respect, and with doing the real-time monitoring, I think you could probably say, and being able to take out any out of line or out of limit water almost immediately out of the system. In many, and probably most respects, that water would be safer than the safest water that we drink in the world currently.
Great. Charles. I've been sitting here trying to frame my question. I like what Tim said about the source water issue. And as I was thinking about the source water, I was also thinking about what Chuck was showing us on one slide, where many other water sources, especially with regard to the sea, have similar levels, 65, 66, 64. And what I'm wondering is this process eventually going to result in more restrictive drinking water standards than we have, just because we're looking at wastewater, sourced water, and then we start to say, if the potable water outcome for wastewater source water has to be this, and someone might ask, well, then why doesn't the surface water, have to be this, or why doesn't the groundwater source water, potable water, have to be this, the same levels? And so the small communities really wind up with the same issue at the end of the day, because it's really a source water issue. What's your reaction to that line of thinking?
Well, actually, John and I were discussing that a little bit before the meeting, that there might be a trickle-down effect here. And I sort of maybe compare it with the wastewater treatment side, where in Arizona since 2001 we've had requirements for really high-performance wastewater treatment plants. And I think that's trickled down into other plants, those treatment technologies. They become readily available now, and they're well known, in terms of engineering and scientific knowledge, and that's trickled down into treatment plants that may not be a requirement, and even I think outside of Arizona too, where you set a standard, and that becomes. It is possible that some of this might trickle down to the run-of-the-mill drinking water treatment plant in the future, and some of it would be great tools too in terms of real-time monitoring. Be able to do real-time monitoring for a run-of-the-mill treatment plant, and that technology is there or almost there right now. So I think it will have some benefit, but potentially it could result in better treatment of water all around. And I think we can approach the question in several different ways. One of them is in terms of the MCLs. There's thousands of these compounds that don't have MCLs out there, and so it probably will result in a movement to try to identify those compounds that might really have a health risk, like MDMA, a disinfection byproduct, and sort of move. Developing an MCL is a long process, 6, 8, 10-year process, getting an actual limit out there. But being able to identify those that truly do have a health risk, and eventually coming out with numerical limits for those, and I think that's actually a plus in the end.
Yeah, just to add on to that, that was a great question. That's one we struggle with all the time. Just looking at the history of whether you're dealing with the surface water rules associated with wastewater treatment, or going to the Safe Drinking Water Act rules associated with potable water production, who in the end is the ultimate responsible party if any of these emerging compounds end up regulated or have a health-based advisory? If a community drinking water, and think of a community where it's not the same entity doing both. You could have a community where wastewater is a different governmental entity than drinking water. We actually have a very large example of that in the state. If the surface water rules allow a wastewater discharger to not deal with emerging contaminants. However, the drinking water provider wants to move to direct potable reuse. Who's the responsible party for making that water available prior to that advanced water treatment process? Does it end up falling back to the wastewater customers, or does it fall into the drinking water customers, or is it shared responsibility? So which act is it going to end up eventually being? Using nitrate as an early example, wastewater treatment plants that discharge to surface water or an aquifer that may be used for a drinking water purpose, they become the responsible party for treating nitrate. Should they also become the responsible party for treating 1,4-dioxane 20 years from now? I don't know. Those are going to be some tough discussions that are going to happen in our industry, definitely moving forward. It's a great question. Any other questions or comments from the committee members? Okay, great. I'd like to thank our two speakers. What we're going to do next now is we do have an audience in the room present. So I know, Martin, you have a microphone. So if there are any questions in the audience for our two speakers or for committee members in general to think about at this time, we'll open it up. Don't be shy. Okay, not seeing any questions. You guys did great with the microphones, by the way, Zach and Martin. Fantastic. Yeah. So going on to discussing the next steps for this committee, there's a few things that we want to, because this is a part of the augmentation council, so by its scope, we're looking for future water. But as a recycled water committee, our future water is actually repurposing water that may be already present. So we're kind of a unique committee in that aspect. One of the items that I think we should discuss in future meetings, and I'll make sure to discuss it with the department moving forward, is when you're recycling water and if you're using it to augment one area and repurposing to augment a different area, we may open up conflicts and who actually owns the recycled water and what the end purpose ultimately is. A lot of recycled water around the state right now, if it's not used in either a recharge component, it may be going to a surface water, it may be being released to a watershed or a river. Well, that's creating an environmental habitat. So if there's future considerations of repurposing water, recycled water to meet other needs within our communities around the state, is there going to be a conflict with the environment that water is currently supporting? I don't know, but I think that's a topic that we should probably be cognizant of and be willing to discuss that, because I do believe it probably will end up being a direct conflict within a community of how that water is recycled or repurposed. Just a reminder, moving forward, we did have talks in our first meeting from Flagstaff on industrial uses. We had Bob give a presentation on Palo Verde, on energy uses. We also had the Tucson water irrigation or classical recycled water experience, and then we had the two other presentations today. Moving forward, our next step, the next meeting after this is actually a meeting of the full GWAC committee, where I believe most of the committees are going to be giving summary reports on the activities that have taken place so far in their committees and raising any other additional questions or answering additional questions from the full committee regarding what our committee tasks are. That takes place on February 10th, I believe. Is it going to be in this room? Okay, it'll be at this room at 10 a.m., again at the ADWR on the third floor up here at, 110 West Washington? There we go. 110 West Washington. So hopefully everybody can make it for that. One other thing I want to add about recycled water moving forward, what the state is doing, the National Water Reuse Symposium will be in Phoenix in September. I believe September, I want to say 10th through the 13th. 10th to the 13th. So the Water Reuse Symposium, that's a national organization that the state of Arizona has a section of, will be in our state this year. It comes around about once every 7 years. So it will be in Phoenix at the Renaissance Hotel downtown. In addition to that, there was what's called the Water Innovation Challenge that the Arizona Community Foundation sponsors, and this was the second year they did this, and several of us on the committee, as well as members of the Water Reuse Association and AZ Water, we had a proposal to do a demonstration direct potable reuse treatment plant that would travel around the state or be located in several areas of the state, treating wastewater to potable use for the primary purpose of making beer. So this is a project that has teamed up local brewers with local wastewater treatment facilities and drinking water suppliers, and this project comes to a culmination at the September Water Reuse Symposium. So look for news about that. I know several newspapers around the state have already covered it. There's going to be a documentary done by our local PBS affiliates in the state that this project will ultimately be documented. And if you do go to the Water Reuse Symposium in September, you will have the opportunity to try beers from around the state made with direct potable reuse from their local wastewater treatment plants. So it's something that's very exciting that's going on, but it's hopefully we're going to be using it as an educational tool for the advancement of this technology across the state. So with that, if there is not any more comments, I will move to adjourn this meeting at 11:45. Thank you.